The next international crime that Putin can be accused of violating, number three, is known as crimes against humanity. I'm sure you've heard that term out there at some time, but this is a separate set of crimes from war crimes, though there's a lot of acts that are war crimes that are also crimes against humanity or one or the other. So they're very similar when you look at the specific acts, but the idea here is it's against the civilian population, not against the military. It's not in an armed conflict necessarily. Initially, historically, these came out of the Nuremberg Principles, the so-called London Charter, which articulated the concept of crimes against humanity, the horrible things that happened in the Holocaust, the Second World War, etc. But crimes against humanity are a specific category of international crimes, the focus of which is to protect humanity from being attacked, civilian groups in countries. In my opinion, the 9/11 attack was a crime against humanity. It was an attack by non-governmental agents, arguably non-governmental agents, maybe working under Al-Qaeda, who attacked the civilians in the World Trade Towers and killed several thousand of them. So that is an attack against civilians. They also did the Pentagon, which would be kind of like a war crime, but the agents there were a non-governmental agent and what we call those non-state actors. So probably, in my opinion, there are more of crimes against humanity. Again, initially, crimes against humanity had to be connected with an armed conflict. There needed to be a nexus between the armed conflict and attacks against civilians. So normally, classically, armed conflict was soldiers in country A versus soldiers in country B. And when attacks started happening against civilian groups for whatever reasons, specifically attacking civilian groups, the crime against humanity was developed to protect civilians. Historically, initially, it was soldiers who died in battle. Today, it is civilians who die in armed conflicts. The percentage of civilians versus military who die or are wounded in conflicts has increased exponentially over the years, such that, again, most of the victims of armed conflict are civilians. Unfortunately, mostly female and elderly. But that's one of the sad realities of armed conflict today. It's not soldiers who are dying. It's civilians who are not engaged in combat. So crimes against humanity, they're now defined as crimes involving a widespread or systematic attack. It's not just one person attacking one civilian person. It's a widespread attack. Widespread or systematic against the civilian population. Not just against a one person or a group of persons, but a population, a whole population of people. Now, I'm not going to get into the numbers there, but it's a multiple. You're attacking the civilian population as such. They could now happen during armed conflict time, wartime, or during times of peace. And during times of peace, the government could attack a group of civilians, part of the population, and that might constitute a crime against humanity, not a war crime, because they're not at war with those people, but if they attack them, that would be considered a crime against humanity. So in times of peace, crimes against humanity can happen. In times of war, they can happen too. And a lot of these, as you hear what they are, the elements, you will see that there's a lot of crossover with the law of armed conflict, the law of war crimes. So I'm going to read you the sources of crimes against humanity, again, first coming from the Nuremberg trials and what's called the London Charter, which established crimes against the peace, act of aggression, crimes against humanity, and then war crimes as the three major categories of crimes that were used to prosecute the Nazis. So now we have already done the crime of aggression, we've done the war crimes, now we're getting to the third category, crimes against humanity. They're found written down in the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. They've also been used in some of the ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. These and the other two categories that I've mentioned before, genocide and war crimes, have also been used and applied, and people have been convicted and prosecuted and sentenced under those international criminal norms in other contexts under a particular statute for that particular judicial body created by the UN. And then in some national courts there have been prosecutions based on these international criminal norms also. States are supposed to be taking these international norms and transforming them into the national legal system, into the criminal law. So that's supposed to be happening. Some states have, some states have not. Some states have incorporated these international instruments into their law and cite them right from the text of the existing law. Now, the first source of crimes against humanity comes out of the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind, and crimes of humanity under the draft code are as follows. A crime against humanity means any of the following acts when committed in a systematic manner or on a large scale and instigated or directed by a government or by any organization or group. So a non-government such as Al-Qaeda or the Taliban could, not as a government but as a group, a fundamentalist group, a religious group, an ethnic group, attack civilian groups, and that would be covered by crimes against humanity. It's not just the government that can do it. Now here are the crimes that are prohibited as crimes against humanity when done against civilian populations. 1, murder. 2, extermination. 3, torture. 4, enslavement. 5, persecution on political, racial, religious, or ethnic grounds. Now this would need to be widespread or systematic. Institutionalized discrimination on racial, ethnic, or religious grounds involving the violation of fundamental human rights and freedoms and resulting in seriously disadvantaging a part of the population. So, an institutionalized discrimination against a racial group, an ethnic group, a religious group of part of the population involving violation of fundamental human rights and freedoms like freedom of movement, the right to vote, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and resulting in seriously disadvantaging a part of the population would be one of the acts prohibited. Next, arbitrary deportation or forcible transfer of population. So, if you take civilians, a group of civilians, and you deport them to another country, that is a crime against humanity. It may also be a war crime too, depending on the circumstances. The next one is arbitrary imprisonment. You throw someone in prison not because they did anything wrong, but you want to scare people, you want to terrorize, or you're just suspicious, you think the person might have done something wrong. Arbitrary imprisonment. The next one is forced disappearances of persons. So if you start making civilians like civilian opposition group members, they're not government, they're just protesters, they're political opponents, and arbitrarily imprison them so you can get them out of the way or shut them up, that would be a violation, a crime against humanity. But this again needs to be on a wide scale or systematic. So forced disappearances. Next one, rape, enforced prostitution, and other forms of sexual abuse. The next one, other inhumane acts which severely damage physical or mental integrity, health, or human dignity, such as mutilation and severe bodily harm. Okay, so these are the sub-crimes under crimes against humanity, and I'm sure some of those you've heard happening in the Ukraine conflict. The next one, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, also has crimes against humanity as one of the sets of crimes that are covered by the court's jurisdiction. In Article 7, crimes against humanity are as follows. For the purpose of this statute, crimes against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. You need to know that this is what you're doing. You're attacking the civilian population. And here are the acts. Murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation or forcible transfer, imprisonment, or severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of law, international law, torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence. The next one, persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, as defined in paragraph 3, or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law in connection with any act referred to in this paragraph or any crime within the jurisdiction of the court. It's complicated, but let's not get caught up in the details. Basically, persecution against another group and committing the acts of, for example, torture or murder or extermination. The crime of, enforced disappearance of persons. Now, this definition of crimes against humanity largely mirrors the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. They're written, just a few years apart, and they're very close to being the same thing, but there are some little differences. Enforced disappearance of persons we just read. Next is the crime of apartheid. Now, what we had in South Africa was called apartheid, where you're forcibly separating groups of people based on some characteristics such as race or religion, etc., and forcing them into living in a particular area to protect yourself from that group. So, the crime of apartheid. Next, other inhumane acts of similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. Take, for example, forcing millions of families in the Ukraine being separated by mothers and children having to flee to other countries while husband stays home and goes to war. Something like that, if that doesn't cause great suffering in a family and among children and the parents, I don't know what does. But this is the kind of act which is widespread and systematic and caused by the actions of Mr. Putin. So using some creative imagination and applying these texts, you can conjure up a charge against Putin for doing those. Okay, next, for the purpose of paragraph 1 of this Rome Statute for crimes against humanity, attack directed against any civilian population means a course of conduct involving the multiple commission of acts referred to in paragraph 1, murder, extermination, torture, against any civilian population pursuant to or in furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such attacks. B. Extermination includes the intentional infliction of conditions of life, inter alia, the deprivation of access to food and medicine, calculated to bring about the destruction of part of the population. Okay? Next, enslavement means exercise of any and all powers attaching to the right of ownership over a person, etc. Next, deportation or forcible transfer means forced displacement of the persons concerned by expulsion or other coercive acts from the area in which they are lawfully present without grounds permitted under international law. And international law doesn't allow you to take them and send them back to your country or even a third country without their consent or other justification. Torture means the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused, except that torture shall not include pain or suffering arising from or inherent in or incidental to a lawful sanction. So if you get punished for robbery and put in jail, that's a punishment that's incidental to lawful sanctions, a criminal sentence. But torture means other kinds of infliction of severe mental or physical pain or suffering. Forced pregnancy. Okay, I think we can understand what that is. Raping women in order to cause them to have children who are mixed race and sort of bastardize their ethnic identity or adulterate it. Next, persecution means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. So persecution, it's intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights. What rights? Right to freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, right to vote, equality, non-discrimination, all of those rights done in a systematic way because they are of a certain characteristic, certain religion, certain ethnic group, is a persecution. Next, the crime of apartheid means inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, murder, rape, etc., committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Next, enforced disappearance of persons means the arrest, detention, or abduction of persons by or with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of a state or a political organization, followed by the refusal to acknowledge that deprivation of freedom, or to give information on the fate or whereabouts of those persons, with the intention of removing the person from any protection of the law for prolonged period of time. That's enforced disappearance. That concludes crimes against humanity. Yesterday I was listening to the news about the Ukraine attack, and there was a Richard Engel report, and the term Russian soldier was accused of crimes against humanity was specifically used because he attacked 2 civilians in a courtyard, and he killed them, raped one of the women, specifically attacking women, which violates the principles of discrimination, attacking non-military objects, etc., but also involves committing a crime against humanity. Now, that was part of a broader plan that seems that there were many rapes, many shootings of civilians, so it was a widespread or systematic action. It wasn't just one person raping one woman or killing one woman. It was part of a massive plan of that regime, what was trying to subdue, overcome, and destroy this other group of people, and this to subdue a state and rename it and bring it back into the Russian sovereignty, which is what Putin is trying to do. Okay, next we're going to go into the international crime of genocide. So we've had the crime of aggression, the international crime of aggression, the international crime of war crimes, the international crime of crimes against humanity,